Now we're at the animation part of our project. I've got a box that is comprised of two pieces of geometry so I can have the lid open as it animates. Now in this process the animation is going to be very short and the frame rate will be reduced so that when we put it in our Acrobat PDF it's a small video file. And to make it easy I'm going to animate the lid opening and closing, and then the box, the bottle, and the stage moving in a 360-degree circle. This way I don't have to worry about the light moving. So the light will remain stationary and everything else will move. So let's start by animating the lid. I'm going to go to my orthographic views, and in my orthographic view I'm going to set keyframes for this lid to open up. Now the animation is going to be no more than 120 frames. So I'm going to set my timeline for 120 frames. Down in the corner here, you'll see that just to the side of number of animated layers, you'll see there are two boxes if you recall. The box on the far right allows us to extend the length of our animation, and the box on the inside allows us to isolate a certain frame range in which to work. So I'm going to make even both of these 120 at this point. I'll go back to the beginning of my timeline. So I'll drag my playback head back to the beginning of my timeline. I could have used the VCR controls that appear over here on the lower right hand corner if I chose. The double triangle with the vertical line would wind this to the beginning, and its counterpart on the other side would go to the end of the animation. So we want to make sure that here, where our frame is referenced at the end of the numerical timeline, that the number 1 appears. I'm going to be rotating this on the z-axis so that the lid opens up. So I'm going to go up to my channels window. Now you're going to see a number of entries here, perhaps these numbers, and I'd like to start out with 0 for translate X, Y, Z and rotate. So if I haven't yet added keyframes, I can go up to modify and choose freeze transform. And it lets me start out with these zeros. Once I've done that, I'm going to go over to rotate Z. I will click on the word rotate Z and choose key selected. I'll see a red box inside rotate Z in the channel window, and its counterpart in the timeline will be a vertical red line as well. Now I'm going to go to the end of my timeline, the 120 frames. I'll click on my double-headed triangle at the end of the VCR control, and now I'm just going to randomly tip this up to the angle I'd like it to be. Just enough to open the box so we can see the product inside. And each of you will have your own take on this. And you'll see now it's giving me approximately minus 42 degrees. Let's go to our perspective window and see what we have here. Now I'm just going to preview this to see what it looks like. So I'll rewind. And I can do one of two things. I can click on the larger triangle of the two in the center, the one to the right, and that will play my animation for me. Or if you choose to use keyboard functions, the escape would stop a animation preview, and the option and letter V would start it. So those are your two options. Whatever you're comfortable with will work fine. I'll hit escape to stop this. Now I also want this to rotate 360 degrees on its y-axis as well. I'll go back to the beginning of the movie. I'm going to group everything now, so I'll select the base, I'll select the bottle, and I'll select the lid and the box. And I'm going to hit Command G. Now once I've done that, I can center my pivot. Now we're going to go into our top view. And in my top view, I'm going to move the center pivot between the bottle that's outside the model and the box itself. I'll hold down D on the keyboard and I'll drag on the axes to place this where I'd like it to rotate from. This can always be moved once I've keyframed and animated, but this will get me started. I'm going to return to my perspective view, and once again I'll select all those elements by clicking on one of the components and hitting the up arrow on my middle keypad. There it says group 1. I know everything's in group 1, but I'm going to take the opportunity to make a name for this, so I'll just call it box underscore stage, and then I'll save it. Once again, I'll make sure my playback head is at the beginning of my timeline. I'll go over to my channel window. I'll right click on the word rotate Y and choose key selected. Now I'll go to the end of my animation and I will change the 0 for rotate Y to 360. And now let's preview it. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now there's one thing I can do to test this to make sure it looks the way I want and it's centered, nothing is going off the top, left or right of my stage where I might lose my content. And what I'm going to do, I'll hold down my space bar and I'm going to go to Windows Play Blast. In Play Blast, I'm going to set the quality to 50, the scale to 50, and I'm going to check off time range. That will incorporate the 120 frames of our animation in this preview. I'll click on Apply, and it'll generate a QuickTime movie for reference only. When you play your animation, make sure you're not losing any of your content off the top, the bottom, left, or right of your document file. Now what I've also done is in my viewport, my perspective viewport, I've also set the camera gate. And if you recall, there are two buttons for that. There's one that will give you a wireframe and one that will give you a gray skin. That might be a conflict with the whiteness of your platform that your content is on, so choose whatever works best for you. All right, so now we're ready to set the render frame range in our Arnold render settings. Go to your Arnold render view just to preview the setup. This is where it's going to start and end at this shot for me, so you don't want to end it with the back of the box or the side. You'll be able to see the frame-by-frame rendering as well, but make sure before you go through this trouble that you've got that light angle set the way you want. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to click on our render settings, and it's the small Hollywood clapboard with the blue gear in it just to the right of the IPR button. I'm going to click on that, and probably your settings are exactly the same as they were for your still images, and that will serve the purpose pretty well here. So I'm going to start with the common tag. I'll click on it, and I'll name that file. And I'm going to choose the image format of JPEG. You'll see there are a limited amount of renderable bitmap possibilities with Arnold, so JPEG will be fine. I've got the quality set for 50 now. These are things we can take advantage of in this project because everything's got to distill into a PDF, which has to be small enough to be emailed. So I'm going to keep the quality at 50. I'm also going to set the frame padding at 3, and then I'll set the frame range from 1 through 120, and I'm going to set it by frames 4. Now what that means is every fourth frame will be rendered. And again, this is something we could have distilled in After Effects, but if we can reduce our render time in Maya, which is going to take quite a while anyway, we're better off doing that here. All right, so now the Prospective Cameras are camera. I've chosen the scale 640 by 480, and it shouldn't be anything larger than that because, again, it's got to fit in a PDF that's going to be 8.5 by 11. So anything larger than that is really just a waste of your time. So once I've got that set the way I want, I will click on Arnold Render. And if you recall, we had bumped all our sampling up to 4. I'm going to leave it like that, so I've got a pretty nice quality. And I will go back to the Common tab, and I want to make sure that the path of my animation images are directed to my folder. And I can see it's going into the folder that I want to. Now, if in the event you're working in the lab and it's going to the default folder on the computer you're working on, you'll want to go over to the corner of the interface at the very top, and you'll want to go to File, and you'll want to go to Set Project. There you can direct it to the folder at which you will want to render. When you do, it'll prompt you to create a workspace. So do so, name it, and direct it to your folder. All right, so now I'm ready to render. I'll close out the settings, hold down the space bar, and I'm going to go to Render, and I'm going to choose Render Sequence. Now, if you're rendering in the lab, you can use Batch Render. I'm using Render Sequence because I didn't get the license for my computer, and Render Sequence will give you the same thing, but it'll bypass the license. So if you're working at home and you haven't gone through the annoying process of acquiring and installing the render license for Arnold, Render Sequence would be your choice. I'm going to click on that. I'll render out my frames, and then we'll take a look at it once we're done with our rendering. Now we're going to import our frame sequence into After Effects and then generate the QuickTime movie that will go into our PDF. So I'm opening up After Effects, and I'm going to go to File, Import, File. And if I was to go to my folder, I'll see that there are 30 frames that have been generated because of the settings of every 4 frames. So there are the frames we're going to use for this process. I'll select one of the frames. Any one out of sequence is fine as well. And down at the bottom, I'm going to choose Import JPG Sequence, and then I'm going to choose Force Alphabetical Order. Now I'm doing that because these aren't sequential. It goes from 1 to 5, then 9, then 13, and so on. So there'll be errors if I did not choose Force Alphabetical Order. I'll click on Open, and I can see it's put this sequence in for me in my Project tab. Now I want to create a composition based on the shape of this movie, the 640 by 480. So with my left mouse, I'll click on that little blue icon and drag it over the new comp icon in After Effects. And now it's put that movie inside my composition. Now it's a very finite amount of time. So I've got to extend this out to 10 seconds, and then I've got to change the speed of the 30 frame sequence to 10 seconds as well. So I'm going to go to Composition, Composition Settings, and I'm going to set my duration to 1000, which is the equivalent of 10 seconds. And then I'm going to click on my timeline. I'll hit the minus on the keypad to show me my entire timeline. So these 30 frames now have to go the extent of our 10-second time frame in our comp timeline. I'm going to right-click on the clip in the timeline, choose Time, Time Stretch, and then in the little box at the top where it says New Duration, I'm going to change it to 1000 as well. And now I've got the 30 frames that we generated in Maya stretched out over a 10-second duration. And that's going to be the speed of the animation that will show up in our PDF when we're done. I'm going to save this, and then we're going to export this out. Now, we're not going to use the render queue inside of After Effects. We're going to select the clip in the timeline. We're going to go to File, Export, Add to Media Encoder. And it's going to open up the media encoder in the Adobe suite. And there is my composition that I just created inside of After Effects. Now this is going to give me the opportunity to reduce the size of this file to 1/3 the size it would have been had I just generated H.264 inside of After Effects. So this is something that's definitely desirable. Now, and when it comes in, if it doesn't initially say H.264, you would click on this little V, and you'll see there's H.264. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to click right on the H.264, that blue text, and it's going to bring up my render queue. And in the render queue, I'm going to be able to determine the frame rate and the range for which it will export my movie. On the left-hand side, I see a preview of my composition. And down at the bottom, it says source range. I want to make sure that this says work area. I'm going to come over to the right-hand side now, and I'm going to reduce the frame rate. So I'm going to click on the checkbox at the far right-hand side, and I'm going to drop it down to as far as I can get it, which is 10 frames per second. I'm going to scroll down a bit on the right-hand side, and I'm going to choose the target bit rate. I'm going to change that to 12 as well, and I'm going to make sure that the maximum bit rate is 12 as well. The next thing I want to do is to click on where it says output name, and I'll call it Bird Box, and I'll save it to my desktop. And now I'm going to click OK in the lower right-hand corner. All I need to do now in the render media encoder is click on the green arrow or green triangle in the upper right-hand corner of the queue. Now, if I was to take a look at that file, here's my QuickTime movie, 1 cycle, 10 seconds. And if I wanted to see the size of this by hitting Command-I, I can see that this file is only 1.8 megabytes. Had I exported directly from After Effects, it would probably be about 3.6 megs. And this is something to consider when we start to compile all our files inside of Adobe Acrobat. So we'll hold on to our QuickTime movies, and the next step will be to composite everything in Acrobat.